U.S. President Donald Trump has canceled trade talks with Canada over an anti-tariff advert released by the Ontario government featuring former Republican President Ronald Reagan.
With the clock ticking down to reach a deal with Donald Trump, the Prime Minister is now publicly lowering expectations.
Imagine that a single phrase uttered at a business lunch turns the economic map of the continent upside down. One laugh and decades of dependence collapse like a house of cards. America, accustomed to dictating the rules, suddenly finds that its main partner is no longer playing by its script. Canada, a country that many considered a polite neighbor to the north, suddenly declares, "We are not just participants in the game, we are changing the field." In the fall of 2005, the whole world saw what true independence means. While Washington was making threats about tariffs and accessible markets, Ottawa was preparing a quiet revolution. No loud slogans, no demonstrations, but a cold strategy and precise calculations. When the American administration proposed that Canada accept so-called access fees, a fee for entering the U.S. market, everyone expected the usual compromise. Everyone except one person. On stage at the Canadian Club, in front of hundreds of business leaders, this man did not argue or justify himself. He just smiled and said, "I prefer Costco." It was a simple joke, but it said it all, a challenge, irony, and a new philosophy. The room erupted in laughter, while across the ocean, alarm bells rang, because behind this phrase was not humor, but power. Over the course of several months, Canada built an alternative network of alliances with Europe, Asia, and the Pacific region. Not in search of protection, but in search of equality. Not asking, but offering. And when Washington tried to exert pressure, it heard a confident no in response. For the first time in many years, its northern neighbor not only defended its position, but changed the very dynamics of power on the continent. While the White House was talking about tariffs, Canada was building factories. While America demanded loyalty, Canada invested in partnership. And when the world sought stability, it was Ottawa that proved to be the place where it was found. Even in matters of defense, Canada refused to play by someone else's rules. No expenses for the sake of a checkmark, no decisions made out of fear. Only cold calculation, data, and confidence. The Arctic has become a symbol of this new era. Where Canadian troops used to appear only a few months a year, they are now present permanently. 365 days a year, year after year, not as a gesture against anyone, but as a demonstration. Sovereignty is not a statement, it is a daily action. This shift did not happen overnight. It was born out of dozens of meetings, hundreds of decisions, thousands of hours of preparation. But when the moment came, the whole world understood. Canada no longer asks for permission. It builds, creates, leads. And at that moment, for the first time in decades, America found itself not at the center, but on the sidelines of its own game. Today, we will examine how a single speech changed the perception of leadership, why investors from around the world are now looking not to Washington, but to Ottawa, and what it means when a country decides to no longer be a shadow. This is a story of how calmness defeated shouting, strategy surpassed pressure, and self-confidence became a new source of strength. The world watched as the familiar order collapsed. A year ago, no one would have believed that Canada, a country usually calm, diplomatic, and careful in its wording, would dare to challenge the United States, not at the level of symbols or words, but at the very core of international trade. It all started when Washington introduced a new economic initiative, a series of access fees for the American market, which, according to the administration's plan, were supposed to level the playing field between the U.S. and its partners. In reality, it was an ultimatum. Either you play by our rules, or you lose access to North America's largest market. For Mexico, this was painful. For Europe, it was alarming. But it was Canada that found itself in the spotlight. Ottawa's official position initially appeared cautious. For several weeks, Canadian representatives commented on the situation in restrained terms, stating the need for dialogue and mutual understanding. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. A group of economic advisors began working on alternative trade models, exploring the possibility of reducing dependence on U.S. supplies and strengthening ties with Asia and Europe. Specific steps were discussed at meetings in Toronto and Ottawa: the accelerated introduction of digital currencies for foreign trade, the creation of a new transatlantic corridor involving the Scandinavian countries, and even the construction of strategic storage facilities for critical resources so as to no longer depend on supply chains controlled by the U.S. As usual, the American side expected Canada to agree. Over decades of relations, a stereotype had developed. Canada is a reliable partner, but not a player. However, on November 6, 2025, this image collapsed. On stage at the Canadian Club, in front of hundreds of influential business leaders and journalists, Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a speech that instantly became symbolic of a new era. His speech was not announced in advance as historic, but everything changed in a minute. When a journalist asked him how Ottawa was responding to the American model of membership in world trade, Carney smiled and said, "I prefer Costco." The room fell silent at first, then burst into laughter. The phrase spread around the world in a matter of hours. It was both simple and deadly accurate. The essence of American trade policy boiled down to the fact that access to the market was turning into a paid privilege, like admission to an elite club. Carney exposed the absurdity of the situation in one sentence. But the main point is not the joke. The main point is that behind it lay a whole political and economic course that had been planned in advance. A few months earlier, the Canadian government had begun a series of closed-door negotiations with representatives of the EU, South Korea, Australia, and India. These meetings were not publicized, but their goal was obvious: to create a belt of stable partnerships independent of Washington's trade threats. According to some sources, as early as the summer of 2025, a memorandum of intent was signed between Canada, Japan, and Norway on a joint fund for the development of Arctic infrastructure. This document became the prototype for a new model of cooperation. None of the parties dictates the terms. Each receives equal benefits and transparent rules. The American press reacted instantly. Some called it the greatest act of economic defiance since World War II. Others called it a dangerous provocation. Rumor has it that an emergency meeting was held at the White House to discuss possible countermeasures, ranging from temporary restrictions on technology supplies to a review of Canadian oil quotas. But Ottawa was no longer listening to threats. Financial analysts who had previously predicted a fall in the Canadian dollar were now forced to admit the opposite. The market reacted with growth. Investors saw Canada not as a rebel, but as an island of stability. While the U.S. was drawn into another cycle of tariff conflicts with China and the EU, the Canadian economy demonstrated stability and confidence. International funds began to increase their share of Canadian assets, and major corporations from Germany and South Korea announced plans to relocate their production facilities to Ontario and British Columbia. But if we look at events without hyperbole, it all started not with a speech, but with a feeling. The feeling that Canada was finally ready to act, not as a junior partner, but as an independent force. According to insiders, cabinet meetings even discussed a scenario of temporarily restricting imports of American agricultural products in response to tariff pressure, a step that would have been impossible 5 years ago. In his speech, Carney not only ridiculed the American model, but also made it clear that the time for diplomatic courtesies was over. He uttered words that made headlines everywhere. "We will not pay for access to a market that we helped build." This phrase became a manifesto of new economic sovereignty. In the days that followed, there was talk in the U.S. of a Canadian threat. Conservative commentators accused Ottawa of ingratitude, while liberals accused it of political adventurism. But in Canada, the reaction was the opposite. From Vancouver to Halifax, words of support were heard. People, tired of the constant feeling of dependence, saw this position as a symbol of awakening. The turning point came when it became clear that the loud statements were backed up by real action. Just a week after Carney's speech, the Department of Commerce announced plans to create a joint investment fund with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development to support new Arctic routes. A month later, Canada signed an agreement with South Korea on joint shipbuilding projects for northern ports. Against this backdrop, Washington tried to exert pressure through diplomatic channels, threatening to revise the terms of the USMCA. But the threat turned out to be empty. 85% of Canadian exports already entered the U.S. market without tariffs, and the very idea of an access fee had no legal basis in existing agreements. Carney used this fact as an argument against it, not aggressively, but clearly. He showed that Canada was not playing protest, but strategy. When global agencies published excerpts from his speech, the reaction was overwhelming. In London, analysts called it the new doctrine of the North. In Berlin, politicians spoke of the Canadian approach to sovereignty. Even in Washington, despite their irritation, they acknowledged that Ottawa had done what no one expected. It had shown that it was possible to be an ally of the U.S. without being dependent on the U.S. Thus, a new image of the country was born, not just polite, not just economically stable, but confident, strategic, and independent. It all started with a joke, but behind it were months of work and years of unspoken irritation. Canada no longer asked for permission, it simply began to act. And at the moment when the Canadian Club Hall erupted with laughter and the cameras broadcast this moment to the whole world, it became clear. The old order was over. America could continue to dictate, but not everyone would listen to it anymore. This speech was not just a response to tariffs. It was an act of symbolic independence. Canadians saw in Carney not a politician, but a leader who for the first time said aloud what the country had long thought: dependence is a choice, and respect cannot be bought with tariffs or threats. And from that moment on, Canada ceased to be a secondary player in the North American arena. It became the stage on which a new chapter in the continent's history is being written. When the initial emotions after the famous speech subsided, it became clear that there was a carefully constructed plan behind it. Canada did not simply refuse to comply with the American tariff model. It had already created an alternative. A few months before the public conflict, quiet diplomatic work began. A closed working group, unofficially known as Task Force North, was operating in the Prime Minister's office. Its task was simple in wording, but grandiose in scale: to build a new architecture for world trade in which Canada would not be dependent on Washington's will. It included former diplomats, economists, energy sector strategists, and representatives of private corporations involved in the Arctic and technology. They met not in the halls of Parliament, but in remote residences on the coast of Hudson Bay, where they discussed transport route schemes, new standards for hydrogen exports, and the possibilities of digital payments without the dollar as an intermediary. By May 2025, Canada had already signed several preliminary trade cooperation agreements with Japan, Poland, and India. These agreements were not publicized, but it was precisely these documents that allowed Ottawa to calmly weather the period when the U.S. began to apply tariff restrictions to its European partners. In essence, Canada became an alternative gateway for transatlantic trade. Its ports, especially Halifax and Prince Rupert, began to receive cargo redirected from European routes, which was then distributed across the North American continent. International companies saw this not as a risk, but as an opportunity. Canada's economic independence became its main export product. Against the backdrop of this economic reformatting, equally important shifts were taking place in the energy sector. After the U.S. attempted to link oil supplies to defense spending requirements, Canada decided to change its approach to its own energy policy. The government announced a new concept, the low-carbon continuum, which essentially meant that every barrel of oil produced in the country had to be accompanied by investment in carbon capture technology or the development of renewable energy. The first large CO2 storage facilities, jointly funded with Norway, began to be built in Alberta.